Hi, everybody. I'm Mirko Heinle from accounting. Thank you very much for having me. I'm incredibly humbled in the presence of all this really interesting climate research. What I have done basically together with Henry Friedman from UCLA and Irina Luneva, who's a PhD student at Wharton, is sort of combine Brian's and Luke's thoughts here and ask the question, what happens when we have investors who care about ESG and how does it interact with managers' sort of choices about managing their own firms? However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in a bigger bucket and ask, how does accounting even fit in this general topic? And basically, if we want to change anything about corporate choices, if we want to tax anything, if we want to cap anything, we have to start measuring it. And once we start measuring it, we can mandate firms to disclose what it is that we have measured, what their impact is, what their choices are. And then basically we can sort of hope in Luke's spirit that this disclosure enables investors to then price the impact that the firms have, and that managers who then care about a stock price start incorporating not only profits, but also incorporate their environmental impact that their choices have. And that sort of brings us back to accounting, because ultimately part of the reason that we have accounting, that we have accounting systems is the separation of ownership and control sort of needed a mechanism for owners to be able to control what the management of their firms would do. And effectively, if you sort of think about the climate change problem that we have right now, is that we have such a difference between a separation between ownership and control. All of us sort of own the future of this planet, and future generations own the future of this planet. However, in control are people that only feel sort of part of that impact. Now, one thing that really helped accounting is that financial impact is easily measured with something like an expected cash flow, and environmental impact is going to be much harder. At the heart of accounting is sort of the topic of aggregation. How do we aggregate different sources, and financial accounting, different sources of cash? And in part, that helps investors or stakeholders in a firm to take a lot of different things together and look at the aggregate impact. When we think about environmental impact, it gets a lot harder because we have very heterogeneous environmental impact. So how do we aggregate carbon emissions, nuclear radiation, microplastic waste in oceans, and get sort of all of that together into one core number that we then can regulate or that we then can disclose? And we can think of a couple of ways to aggregate it. The EPA, for example, measures their impact by lives lost or lifespan reduced, aggregate lifespan reduced of sort of a waste site, and then sort of uses that to punish the firm that is responsible for it. In the research that I have with Henry and Irina, we're basically building an analytical model. We assume that some investors care about ESI, environmental social impact, and that all investors care about cash flows. And then we assume that a manager takes actions and that the manager is interested in increasing price. We allow a couple of actions that have sort of different impact on the firm's cash flows, as well as on the environmental impact. And we allow some that sort of just have an impact on the report, something like greenwashing, where a firm just sort of pretends to be green through the ESI reporting. And then the ESI report in and of itself is an aggregate of sort of the impact that the firm has. And then we start varying the way that we aggregate. We aggregate along the cash flow impact, making it more look like an annual earnings report. We aggregate along an environmental impact, or we aggregate along some other dimensions. And basically what we then sort of see is that investors update what the manager has done. Since all investors update on cash flows, a cash flow aggregation has sort of a relatively strong price impact. And oddly enough, a cash flow aggregation leads to more greenwashing because the manager can move price more than they could otherwise. But this cash flow impact aggregation also leads to an emphasis on efforts that create cash. So we're basically in the trade-off between environmental impact and cash. Managers will pronounce cash more. If we flip it around and move to an ESI congruent measurement, we're going to get a little less greenwashing. We're going to get a little more better environmental impact, but we're going to start sacrificing cash, very much along the lines that Brian has talked about it earlier. We allowed for another way of aggregating here, and basically sort of taking the idea that we're going to aggregate information by the average investor preferences, which is obviously in reality really hard to do. I need to know what fractions of investors cares, and I need to know how strongly they care. However, if we're able to do something like that, we realize that this actually maximizes the price impact, therefore maximizes greenwashing, but allows a price-interested manager to sort of to make the same trade-off that the aggregate that investors would do in aggregate. All right, now that we're here, where does it take us? really, if you sort of think about how ESI, how environmental impact gets into prices, it needs to be the case that investors' demand is actually impacted by it. If we think about us as investors delegating our choices to, for example, mutual funds, and we know that mutual fund managers are driven by returns, then they're going to make choices that maximize their returns, not that maximize environmental impact. What we would really need then is a ranking that is based on the environmental impact that an asset manager had through the firms that they were holding in their assets. So we would need to know what is the impact of holding, GM shares for 17 and a half hours on February 19th. And that is something that is obviously relatively hard to do. Anyhow, with all of this, efficient capital markets need information to work. Information needs to be provided, it needs to be measured, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be efficient to use. And at the end of the day, that's sort of an accounting job. So this is how accounting could contribute here. Thank you very much.